Many people are referring to themselves as the daughters of desolation. They might not know that they are referring to themselves as the daughters of desolation, but that's exactly what's going on. And what we're going to talk about is not being deceived related to seeking identity. Some people feel very lost. They feel very confused about ancestry and about their identities and about their histories. And many people are latching on to any identity that might make them feel good, that might make them feel recognized, that might make them feel acknowledged in terms of the historical narrative. And in some instances, individuals are identifying with religious identities related to ancestry in order to feel a sense of belonging and to feel a sense of importance. And again, all of this may be relatively normal. However, there's also a focus on being associated with an important human being on earth and identifying with that important human being more so than identifying with the creator. And that's where this whole dynamic of referring to oneself as a daughter of desolation comes from. We're going to talk about how this comes about and how people are calling themselves the daughters of desolation in disguise. And I am specifically directing this topic of conversation to individuals who identify as Indigenous Americans. There is an identity, a new identity that has been put on many of these individuals, and it has caused many of them to now identify themselves as a daughter of desolation. We're going to talk about what it means to be desolate in just a second, but I want you to really think about if you are Indigenous, are you really a daughter of desolation? And if you are not a daughter of desolation, why are you calling yourself that? Why are you so hungry for an identity that you would allow someone to put this type of title on you? Why are you so hungry to belong to a chosen or elite identity that you would be willing to take on this identity along with it? Now, what is desolation all about? When you look at the etymology of desolation, you see that it relates to this idea of sorrow, grief, and affliction. It relates to this construct of, we've talked about this before, Apollyon. It relates to this idea of Abaddon. And you have to ask yourself, do you really want to be associated with dynamics related to Apollyon and Abaddon? If you don't know what those two constructs represent, you might want to go back and look at our discussion or do a little research for yourself. And so when someone is desolate, not only are they suffering from grief and sorrow, but it's also another way to indicate that someone is in a desert state, a barren state, a wasted state. And there are many individuals that are referring to Indigenous women in this manner in order to get them to take on this identity. And let's just be clear, it's that Shem identity. And I am challenging you to really, really think about whether or not that's actually your identity, first of all. And then, second, is that something that you want someone else calling you? Is that something that you want to integrate into your spirit? Is that something that you want to be a part of your being? Do you want that to be the essence of you? Do you want that to be emblematic of you? Do you want to be emblematic of desolation? Now, this daughter of desolation construct comes by way of identifying with the word Zion. Now, Zion has a root that is also related to Sion, so a descendant, a branch off of something. However, that's not exactly what's being referred to when individuals are identifying themselves as the daughters of a Zion. And actually, when you look in scripture, you will see often this idea of the daughter of Zion. It is a chastisement identity. It's not something that is an elevated identity. It might seem like it is because it's related to that mountain. However, it's related to a construct, again, of desolation. What's happening here is people are latching on to identities from a book that many have not read. Many are taking sort of sound bites from the book or receiving sound bites from other people about the book and latching on to whatever feels good or sounds good about the book. The book is a heavy indictment. And so before you get yourself all indicted, you might want to read the book carefully, deconstruct the book very carefully, do an exegesis of the book before you take on a number of these identities that are not necessarily positive identities. Now, of course, some of the identities have been elevated, and so, of course, some people want to be associated with these elevated identities. But sometimes embedded in this elevated identity is an identity of desolation. And you see this narrative repeated throughout the Old Testament. And then you see a reiteration of it in the Jesus narrative when he refers to the people essentially as desolate, as ruined, as destroyed. And first, I want to point out to you that according to the narrative, we only have one name for a daughter of Jacob. And so when individuals are attempting to identify as a daughter of Jacob, then they would be identifying as a daughter of Dinah. Dinah is another word for judge. And so individuals are not identifying as the daughters of Dinah, they are identifying as the daughters of Zion or the daughters of various sons that belong to Jacob. The problem with this is that the daughters are the daughters of their mothers. Okay, and so these XX chromosomes are coming from a particular mother, and those mothers are not identified as coming from Jacob. And so, in many instances, the daughters are Egyptian, the daughters are Canaanite, the daughters are coming from a variety of ancestries. In this particular instance, however, Zion is associated with a Canaanite hill. And so it was adopted by David in scripture and identified as the city of David. This is not the city of Jacob. This is not the city of Dinah. Zion is not about Dinah. So it's not about being a daughter of Jacob. This is about being a daughter of something else. And you need to do your own research on that so that you get a better understanding. But we're going to talk about this whole desolation dynamic related to identifying as a daughter of Zion. Now, some of you might have positive attributions related to Zion from younger years and going to church and singing the song, You Are Marching to Zion. However, the narrative that is in that song is inconsistent with the way that the scripture presents Zion, the definition of Zion coming out of the Hebrew, the definition of Zion when you look at the etymology of Zion. It's not consistent with that old church song. And so what you see here is a part of the root of a Zion. And Zion is coming from this word, siyah. Yes, you have some silent stuff going on here with these letters. Anyway, Zion is about dryness and drought. And so when individuals are identifying as the daughters of Zion, you are not going to get away from the dynamic of Zion being about dryness and drought. And so what individuals are essentially calling themselves is daughters of drought, daughters of dryness. And I want to encourage you to do a little research on your own name also because you'll get a better insight into what's being invoked each time someone calls you by your name. And so it's important to know what all of your names mean so that you know what you are actually taking on. Now, back to this Daughters of Desolation dynamic. You can see here, with respect to this word, that women in particular, and men in some instance, because they are identifying with that daughter of Zion allegory dynamic. And so many people are calling themselves the daughters of Zion. Um, but with respect to women calling themselves the daughters of Zion, there again is this dynamic of referring to oneself as the daughter of dry places, the daughter of dryness, the daughter of drought, the daughter of parched land. Do you really want to think about yourself or have anyone else think about you as a daughter of drought, a daughter of barrenness? Is that really something that you should be taking on just so that you can have an identity that you believe is an elevated identity that might not be your identity at all? You know how these transliterations go? This word can kind of sneak up on you, okay? So there are various ways to say Zion or this root. And again, you see that it's related to desert and wilderness. What female wants to be referred to as barren, solitary, drought, dry, desert, and wilderness? Who wants to be referred to in that way? Who wants to actually be that? That's the bigger question. Who wants that as their identity? Because basically, this is referring to something that is lifeless. This has ceased being creative. This has ceased being productive. This is desolate. And here you see it that 67:24 for Sion. So interesting how these words are not pronounced the way they are pronounced in English. So we've got Zion, and you have Sion here. Okay. And so again, there is this dynamic of Sion or Zion being about dryness and parched ground. Continuing on, you see that Zion is rooted in that word that we just looked at before. And again, it's still reiterating drought and dry country. Again, don't be deceived by taking on these identities based upon being attached to someone of prominence. Of course, this is identified as the city of David, but remember, the land, Zion, didn't originally belong to David. It originally belonged to the people known as the Canaanites. And as the narrative goes, this was a desecrated land. And so not only do you have desolate land, you have what has been identified as a land of desecration. And so just because David planted his flag in the land of desecration doesn't change the nature of the land. And so identifying yourself as the daughter of desecration and desolation, it doesn't get any better simply because David has now attached his name to it or planted his flag there. And of course, some people want to focus on the 67:26 definition of Zion, which is a mountain in Jerusalem, also a name for Jerusalem. It doesn't matter how you look at this, it still means the same thing according to scripture: dryness, barrenness, and drought. And if you need a reminder of what it means to be a desert, desolate, drought, barren, you can see that right here. And so this visual here is to give you that reminder of what that's all about. And so when you are referring to yourself in that way, this is what you are referencing. And so that admonition in the New Testament about be not deceived applies here. Don't be deceived into taking on these erroneous identities, these detrimental identities. And to further clarify this idea of desolate, when you're talking about the daughters of desolation, to be desolate means to be deserted of people and a place that is in a state of bleak and dismal emptiness. It's a place that's bare, it's a wasted place, it's a devastated place, it's a ruined place. And so, getting you to go along with being identified as a daughter of Zion is getting you to go along with this psychological manipulation that tells you that you are a product of and a manifestation of desolation. You are, according to this identity, a product of ruin. You are, according to this identity, barrenness, devastated. And while one might tell oneself that this is an identity of prominence, embedded in that identity is this reality. Now, of course, you can call yourself whatever you want to call yourself, and you can respond to any name that you choose to respond to that somebody else might be calling you. You are only encouraged at this point in time to think about what you are calling yourself, what you are answering to, and the implications for calling yourself by those names and answering to those names. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.